Welcome to the Crazy Chicken People podcast. If you're crazy about chickens, then you're in the right place. What's up, everybody? Thank you for tuning in again to the Crazy Chicken People podcast. Today, we're reviewing some of the best and worst chicken care accessories that I've used over the years, and going to talk a little bit about which ones have worked out well and which ones I think are worth avoiding. So, jumping right into it, I want to start with feeders. I don't know about you all, but I've gone through a lot of different feeder types over the couple of years I've been doing this, and probably like a lot of you, I started off using the standard hanging style feeder. They hold a few pounds of food and they get the job done, but I quickly started to see a lot of downside with these. Sometimes they would get disconnected and end up spilling a bunch of feed all over the floor or just shaking around a lot because the birds would jump up on them, and they don't hold a ton of feed. I know they make some bigger ones that'll hold like 15 to 18 pounds, but they seem awkwardly large to be hung up, and I never really liked the open top. The smaller ones just have to be refilled so often if there's more than just a few chickens eating from them. And as widely used as they are, these are my least favorite type of feeder. Although I should mention, when it comes to feeding young chicks, there's not as many options here, and you pretty much have to go with the small version of these. The problem I had with these ones is that just so much feed gets thrown out and wasted. I had tried a few DIY builds, some stuff I saw on YouTube, similar to what I had made for quail, but they just weren't really working out that well for the chicks. I ended up finding these 2-pound feeders made by Wright Farm, and they seem to be the best. Very little waste, and they've got a top on them, which I like. It can keep birds from possibly getting stuck inside there or even jumping up on there and pooping in it. I would take these and put them in a little rubber pan. In fact, actually the first time I used a very small Frisbee, and this would help to catch most of the feed that gets tossed around, so it would still get mostly eaten. And I will share a link to the one I use by Wright Farm. I just really like this feeder for chicks, and you guys might want to check it out too. But back to the full-size options. Another one that I've tried and still use now is the Little Giant 25-pound metal feeder. This one's pretty good. It holds a lot of feed, really well built, but it did have one big downside for me. As much feed as it does hold, there's just not a lot of room for chickens to get in there. A couple at a time can get into feed, and that's about it. I paid $65 for that thing, which is more than I probably should have paid for a feeder. I just didn't realize that at the time, so I didn't want to just toss it. I ended up putting it into one of my smaller coops that's just got 5 birds, so it's still working out fine for them, but I wouldn't want to have it in a coop with many more birds than that. The next one I want to hit on is the Little Giant dome feeder. These come in the 35 and 45 pound size, and they're pretty awesome. They hold a lot of feed. There's plenty of room for 5 or 6 chickens to get in there and eat, maybe more than that. And it keeps the feed really clean because it does have a twist off top to it. So birds can't stand over the top and poop in it or have things falling in there. That's a feature I really like. With all that and the fact that there's really not very much waste on it at all, it's probably the best feeder I've tried. The only negative I can really say about it is the cost. Close to about $100 for the bigger one, and to me, that just feels like way too much to spend on a feeder. The best thing that I've found to use, factoring in price, feed capacity, how easy it is to keep clean, and the waste, is those little feed ports that are available on Amazon and really all over the place. For about $12, I think you get 4 or 6 of those, plus the hole saw that you need to install them. You can cut them into the side of a bucket or maybe a smaller trash can if you really want to get a lot of volume in there. Currently, I'm using a couple of 22-gallon trash cans, each with 3 of the ports cut in, and those are perfect. They work out really well in the coops I have with more birds in them. Also works really well in a 5-gallon bucket. That still holds quite a bit of feed. You take 10 minutes or so to cut the holes and install these, and you've got a really good size feeder for under $20 if you're using a bucket, or maybe $30-$40 if you're using a bigger trash can. I did put mine up on blocks. I discovered that it really helps if you get the feed port right at face level for them, and this will help reduce waste. What I noticed was that if the ports were too low, the chickens would tend to drag some of the feed out. At one point, I had cut a small piece of plastic and just kind of layered it over the bottom 1/4 inch or so of the opening, but I kind of didn't like that. It restricted the birds from getting in and out, and lifting the whole thing up just a little bit, it reduced the waste to a point that I really wasn't even noticing it anymore. So the little giant dome feeder, probably the best one overall that I've found, but the bucket or a trash can with the feeder ports, really right behind it in terms of how well it works and a fraction of the cost. There's a couple I didn't mention here. One is the grandpa feeder. I just haven't used it myself, but it looks pretty awesome. This uses a step lever that opens up the feed tray when the chickens do step in there to get a bite. Definitely helps keep the waste down from what I've read, and will absolutely keep any rodents out of there, which is also a great feature. But I've seen them cost as much as a couple $100 or even more than that, and I just didn't want to shell out that much money for a chicken feeder. And then PVC pipe with a couple elbows at the bottom turned up can hold a lot of feed, but with the cost of pipe and fittings now, they're just not as good as an option as the others, in my opinion, when you're looking at the dollars you would spend either way. Next on the list is waters. There's the kind of old school metal can where you fill it up and then slide the top over, and then the more modern upgraded plastic version of that uses a twist top, and the container sits in a plastic tray. You fill these up, seal the top, and the vacuum that's created only lets enough water out to keep that pan at the bottom full. I've grown to really dislike these. The standard size just doesn't hold a ton of water for one, so you're refilling them pretty often. And maybe that's actually a good thing because these things also get dirty super fast. Chickens are constantly kicking around dirt or whatever you have on the floor in your run, and just about everything seems to find its way in there. And sure, you can go tip it over once a day and get most of that gunk out of there. But because the water in the pan and the water in the tank are joined together through that drain hole, it all gets pretty dirty. So even if you have one of the larger ones that holds enough water for a few days, in my opinion, that water gets gross pretty quick. And they aren't the easiest thing to clean either, especially the ones with the twist-off lid. Getting in there to scrub all the corners can be a pain. And in the summertime, when you're trying to keep your flock in fresh, cool water as often as you can, these are just not the easiest water to empty and fill on a regular basis. And they're not cheap either. You can expect to pay $40, $50 maybe for some of the larger sizes. And I just think there's way better options in that price range that don't require nearly as much attention. A step up from these is the hanging water buckets that you can buy that have the poultry water nipples already installed. They're available in a few sizes, I think anywhere between 3 and 5 gallons, and usually run $30 to $40. I did see a set on Amazon that includes the bucket water with the nipples in it and a bucket with the feeder ports as well. I want to say for $30, and that's a pretty good deal to get you a good quality feeder and water. I'll make sure to put a link for these and some of the other ones I've mentioned in the show notes. The reason I like these so much is that the bucket is just so much easier to clean, to empty, and to refill compared to the vacuum type. Typically, I'll see these sold with the poultry water nipples already installed in them. I used to actually use these in my quail pen, but my chickens just don't seem to care for them. Maybe I have to get them started on these young. I don't know, but I do know that they can be swapped out for the spring-loaded cups that have the same 1/4-inch pipe connection on them. My flock really seems to prefer this style. I'll buy a pack of those off of Amazon and a 5-gallon food-grade bucket. For that setup, you'll spend about $15 and maybe 10 or 15 minutes of your time putting it together. Pretty much the same thing as the hanging buckets I mentioned, but half the price. They do hold plenty of water, and what I really like is that the water in the bucket doesn't get dirty from the water in the cup. In fact, the inside of the bucket stays really clean. And while I would encourage you to keep your chicken's water as fresh as possible, especially in the summer, these just don't need to be emptied and scrubbed nearly as often as the other types. If you keep a short length of copper pipe in the bucket, along with keeping that shaded all day, this will really help keep any algae growth down too. The little cups will still get dirty, but when I walk in the coop at night, I'll just splash the water out with my finger if I notice some dirt, or this time of year, I see a lot of those little frogs in there at night. It always kind of makes me laugh to see them in there. Like, where were you hiding all day that you didn't get eaten? They're just super low maintenance and really easy to fill or empty. This is what I'm using now in all my coops, even in the grow out pens. I've got a couple of these set up into a smaller 2-gallon bucket for the older chicks. The only system that I've seen that's really better than the bucket with the water cup that isn't hooked up to a constant water supply would be using a larger storage tank. If you have that, you can run some piping off of it down to from a couple to as many of those watering cups as you would like to. And this is what I'd actually like to do in my largest coop structure. We've got one setup that is really like 3 chicken coops, all built around the same kind of frame. And I think something like a 50-gallon water-safe storage tank that would be a few feet up off the ground and then piped out to each coop to those spring-loaded cup waterers would be a great setup. That way you can fill the tank with your hose from time to time instead of lugging buckets of water around. It's going to last for quite a while. And really the only downside to it is the cost. A newer water storage tank can run you a couple $100 or more depending on the size of it. Then probably $100 or so in pipe and fittings and all the hardware. But once you've got that set up, it's going to save you a ton of time in the long run. The last option I wanted to mention is the self-filling water bowls. These connect to a hose. They've got a float in them that'll keep the bowl full as long as it's connected to a live water supply. The only reason I don't use these is because I don't like the idea of leaving a hose on all the time. But they work fine even if they're prone to getting a little dirty. It's easy enough to just dump them out, give them a quick wipe, and they fill right back up. These run about $50, which is pretty reasonable when you're comparing it to everything else. If you don't have to worry too much about what might happen if the water runs too long, I think these are a really good option that takes very little work to keep up. And the last thing I wanted to hit on today is coop bedding. There's a lot of options out there for it, and this seems to be a topic I see asked about nearly every day in different chicken groups. I haven't tried everything out there, but I've certainly gone through a bunch of them. And I should mention, my review on these does not cover how well they work if you are using the deep litter method. It's just not something I've tried, so I really can't recommend what to use there. On your coop floor, straw is probably the most commonly used product out there. I think I read something like 3 out of 5 people with chickens are using straw in their coops. No doubt because it's inexpensive, but it's not the easiest thing to clean up, and it doesn't do real well with smell. I do still have a couple of coops that I'm using straw in, but I'm looking to switch those over just as soon as I can make time. Wood shavings are also pretty commonly used, also fairly cheap, cleans up decent, but like the straw, you'll need a lot of space to dispose of this, and it might take up more room in your trash can than you can really give up, and it really doesn't do much for the smell. Also, like the straw, it does kind of contribute to a lot of dust buildup. Definitely works, but not the easiest option I've found. Wood pellets are something I've been using in our brooders in place of shavings. Not right away. It seems like the uneven surface is a little bit tough for a day-old chick to deal with, but after a few days or a week, they seem totally fine on them. I like to use them in the brooders because it's easier for me to clean up and they don't seem to get kicked up into the water as easily. But I didn't care for using the pellets in the coop. For one, it takes a few bags of this to really cover the floor, and to keep replacing those every week can get pretty expensive. They do work well though, and I'm sure you'd be happy with the results. Pretty much the same story with hemp bedding. Works really well. It does help with the smell some, but again, just pretty expensive for something that you're throwing away on a weekly basis. One thing I haven't used is the recycled coffee grounds I've been seeing lately. And actually, I haven't even seen those sold around me anywhere. I think you can order it, but I see people talking about it and really being happy with the results. I love coffee, and it would be awesome if my coop smelled like a fresh brewed pot every morning, but at the price of keeping clean coffee grounds on the floor every week, I just didn't see this working out for me. My favorite option for the coop floor, and what I hope to have all my coops filled with sooner or later, is sand. I'm actually disappointed that I didn't try this a long time ago. Super easy to clean, pretty much like a big litter box. I just rake it out, scoop it with a pitchfork, although I do want to order this thing I saw. It's almost exactly like a litter box scoop, but larger and on a broomstick. I'll share a link for that also, because if you're using sand, you'd probably want this. It doesn't really do much for the smell on its own, but I do sprinkle a good dose of barn lime in there when I'm done cleaning, and that definitely does the trick. And there's very little wasted sand. It's just really easy to pull out the poop and whatever other stuff is in there without losing much of the sand itself. Once you have the right amount of sand in your coop, it's just a little bit of add every month as maintenance. Maybe a bag or half a bag. And it's generally pretty cheap, especially since you're not replacing it every week. If you can buy it by the yard and then just use a 50-pound bag from time to time to top it off, this is going to be the most cost-efficient way to go without sacrificing on performance. One thing I'm interested to see is if using sand in the run will help in the rainy season. If you have a run that's mostly dirt like mine, you know how nasty that mud can get. the mix of wet poop and any feed that spills or food scraps that's in there, it just turns into one of the nastiest smells ever. I don't think I'll go with full sand. I do want to make sure they still have some spots to dig around in the dirt, but hoping that by putting a little gravel down, getting some sand on top of that, it's going to help with the drainage and not have that stinky mud puddle. The last thing I do want to note on the sand that is really important is you've got to get the right type. Typically referred to as all-purpose or construction or concrete sand, it's far more coarse than a play sand, which is important because the finer stuff can get caught up in their crop. It'll start to compact in there, which can cause some serious problems. And many of the play sands are full of things that can be toxic for your chickens to breathe in. So you definitely want to avoid those. That's it for the review today. There was something I wanted to hit on when I mentioned using the barn lime, and it's something I see debated a lot. Standard barn lime at about $4 a bag versus First Saturday lime, which is quite a bit pricier. I haven't used the First Saturday lime myself, but I'm having a hard time believing it's any better than regular lime, let alone worth almost 10 times the cost. So maybe that's something we'll cover down the road, but I need to give it a try. Hopefully this gives you a few things to look at if you're considering switching up your feeders or waters or just having trouble with your current setup. If you're using something cool that I didn't mention, I'd love to see a picture of it. Maybe it'll work better than what I'm using now. Guys, have a great week. Talk to you guys soon.